What was your initial reasoning for joining the military?
I was in the NRTC at Dartmouth and had a scholarship with a payback time of active duty.
As Navy ROTC at Dartmouth, were you pressured to enlist or were you obligated to be commissioned into the military?
An obligation of the scholarship was that you took a commission as an ensign when you graduated.
What inspired you to become a doctor after serving in the military?
Um, After my time of payback, I went back to medical school at Stanford, and that was 5 years plus a year of internship. And after that, I got back into the Navy and eventually ended up at Chelsea Naval Hospital taking care of wounded servicemen.
What inspired your career path change from being a naval aviator to eventually becoming a surgeon?
I had a duty assignment, which at that time was entirely random. There are no duty assignments based on merit or accomplishments, but just where they needed the bodies. And they needed me with a squadron that was in Okinawa, which was a lot of fun, but it did not have any potential for career progression to leadership just because of the nature of that duty. So at the end of that tour, that obligation, I went back to medical school.
After completing your degree in medical school, what influenced you to stay stateside instead of going overseas with the rest of the military?
At that time, after I finished medical school, I was a civilian and not still in the military. Um, I had to go back in the Navy to go through the aviation medicine program. And that sort of led to flying for some time and then eventually going into orthopedic residency at the Boston Naval Hospital.
In your time treating injured veterans, what were some of the most impactful stories you heard?
Quite interesting that at that time, the war in Vietnam was starting to wind down. And as a result, the people who came in during 70 to 72 were enlisted men who had been badly wounded and therefore sent back to the States. Most of them had blast injuries, which required some orthopedic procedures, but mostly skin grafts and rehabilitation. I had a ward of 35 enlisted men that I was responsible for at that time. They were an interesting group. None of them had any potential to go back to active duty or any desire to go back to active duty. So it was kind of a ragtag bunch, but they were interesting to work with.
In your experience with dealing and treating wounded veterans, did their experiences and their dealings with PTSD impact you as a person, or did it impact your community at all?
PTSD didn't exist at that time. Uh, Most of the people dealt more directly with their problems by being, resistant to orders, resistant to whatever they didn't like, since they knew they wouldn't have to go back to active duty. Um, I had a corpsman working with me at that time who had shot himself in the foot with a 45 9 days before he was supposed to be transferred back from Vietnam. He always insisted it was an accident, but it seemed a little strange that that accident would occur so close to his time to come back. He had many educational things for me about the war in Vietnam, his tour in Vietnam, and morale in Vietnam. I don't know if you want to go into that.
Oh, if you have any time to, then I would love to delve into it.
Sure. As I say, he came back. He was a very interesting guy. He was basically had a master's degree in uh, pipe organs. His dad was a doc in Massachusetts, but he was a big help to me maintaining that ward of 35 badly injured patients. And he, when we were together between working on the ward, he told me a number of observations. The first was that almost every time the American troops went on patrol, they were all stoned on marijuana. And that was sort of a suicidal quality, because the Vietnamese could smell the marijuana from half a mile away, and so they knew where the Americans were. Some of the guys who weren't stoned used aftershave, and that was also helpful to the Viet Cong in localizing their enemies. My corpsman also told me that the troops out there would know when they were about to get hit when they went on patrol, because on the days where it was safe to go on patrol, the kids of the village all tagged along and wanted candy and so forth. On the days where they were going to get hit, everybody in the village except the Americans knew it, and so there were no kids along.
So in your area of expertise with the 35 bunks that you had to deal with that were constantly circulating, what was the most common procedures that you had to do?
Fortunately, because of the nature of the blast injuries from landmines and stuff like that, amputations were not our most common operation. Skin grafts were, because these mines were set up to go off as the guy stepped off the mine, not when he stepped on it. So most of them had bad injuries of both legs and sometimes their backs. And so some of them were extensive enough, it was hard to find enough space on their bodies for donor sites for skin grafts. We actually used a procedure called a mesh graft, where you took a piece of skin that might be that wide and that long, and ran it through a machine which cut slots in it so you could stretch it out. Kind of like, you've seen mesh things where you can stretch them, and that allowed us to triple the amount of skin we could cover with a skin graft.
So exactly how long were you working in this hospital dealing with injured veterans?
Let's see, I started at Chelsea right around Christmas of 69, 70, and probably did that for 2 years. Because the residency was broken into segments. And after 2 years at the Naval Hospital, to get more civilian type of training, we were sent across the river to Boston Children's and Mass General to get our training in other types of treatment and surgery.
You told me that you worked with U.S. intelligence and development of the Seeker missile. Can you explain to me what your application was on that project?
I guess you're referring to the time of VX4 at Point Mugu. Well, after my original experiences as a naval aviator and not a doctor, I went back to medical school and then got reassigned to a squadron at Point Mugu, which was heavily involved in experimental work and fine-tuning things that had been planned to try and protect the troops better. Among them, for instance, were constant changes of electric countermeasures trying to defeat the SAMs and the anti-aircraft fire that was taking a heavy toll in Vietnam. We also worked on some interesting things about camouflage that made an airplane harder to see, remarkably. And that turned out to be painting in high gloss like your finest speedboat, instead of that dull gray that Navy airplanes were at that time. We actually did a deployment to Rhode Island, and at that time they had a Vietnamese gun site and a Vietnamese SAM site set up in New Hampshire somewhere. And we worked with them to try and test the electronic countermeasure boxes as they put them in. They were modifying those boxes almost weekly and having our squadron evaluate them. And then we would have a rapid training course for the people at Magoo. And the stuff, the results of that went to Myanmar, where most of the people going to Vietnam were going through training. And that training actually eventually evolved into the Top Gun. So we had a place in getting that set up too.